development of destroyers' capability to defend themselves and the ships they were escorting against air attack is a subject on which I could talk for quite a while. But today I shall concentrate upon the essentials. So we'll talk about the Royal Navy and US Navy, RN and USN, destroyers between the wars. At one time, I'd intended to take the story through to 1945, but in truth, all the problems posed by the air threat had been appreciated by September 1939 and the necessary countermeasures put in train. So why then did the RN in particular lose a worryingly large number of ships, especially destroyers, to air attack in the first half of the 1939-45 war? It's been said that we underestimated the developing air threat, but I would say that's far too simplistic a view. And if there was a fault, my opinion is that the finger should be pointed at those who drafted and agreed the 1930 London Treaty. For even in 1914, some naval officers thought aircraft might pose a significant threat to warships and other vessels. By 1919, that threat was a reality and expected to become even more serious as aircraft performance developed. Hence, some countermeasures had already been adopted. Fleet units might carry fighter aircraft. All ships might be equipped with anti-aircraft guns. But between the wars, a new role was mooted for destroyers. Historically, torpedo boat destroyers had been intended to defend the fleet. By 1919, they'd long since assumed the surface attack role also, and more recently that of defending big ships and/or merchantmen against submarines. As a logical extension of the latter role, it would make sense for them to be able to make at least some contribution to the defence of their charges against air attack. But what was the nature of the air threat, and how might it effectively be countered? In the early 1920s, the principal threat to ships was thought to be from torpedo aircraft. High-level bombers also merited consideration, but naval officers were generally sceptical of their ability to hit a moving target. Between the wars, however, the technique of dive bombing was conceived and developed, not least because its advocates demonstrated their ability to hit ships, even when the latter were manoeuvring at speed. Paradoxically, in the light of subsequent events, the British Fleet Air Arm, formerly part of the RAF, but with a very significant number of its aircrew being Royal Navy, was a leader in that development. I'll return to the matter of dive bombing, but we'll first consider the business of anti-aircraft gunnery as it was seen immediately after the Great War. During the war, it had been appreciated that anti-aircraft gunfire was akin to grouse shooting. To be effective, one had to lead the target, i.e. aim at its future precision. Hence the use at a very early stage of simple deflection sights. But in 1917-1918, the French army brought into service the first practical predictors, devices which, from measured rates of change of the target's horizontal bearing, vertical elevation and range, and projected time of flight, automatically calculated the deflections of one or more AA guns. As evidence that the Admiralty took the air threat seriously from the early 1920s, the cruiser mine layer HMS Adventure was completed in 1925 with a main gunnery armament of 4.7-inch AA guns. Some 2 years later, the battleships Nelson and Rodney were completed with 6 of those weapons, while Courageous and Glorious, when they emerged as aircraft carriers at the end of the 1920s, each carried no fewer than 16 4.7-inch AA. And as anti-aircraft weapons, those batteries were pretty formidable against torpedo aircraft and level bombers. At the time, dive bombing was still a matter for experiment, but they would only be effective if properly controlled. And effective control of long-range AA gunfire, i.e. of heavier caliber than contemporary automatic weapons, from a ship at sea posed difficult and complex problems. However, naval work before and during the Great War on fire control tables, mechanical computers enabling ships' guns firing at long range to hit a moving surface target, had laid the foundations for the design of naval anti-aircraft predictors. The perceived requirement between the wars was not to fire a shell to hit an aircraft, but to explode it by means of a mechanical time fuse a short distance, say 50 or 70 yards, ahead of the aircraft. The latter would, or should, then be fatally damaged by shell fragments. All contemporary predictors, whether for land service or naval, were essentially mechanical, in that the calculations had to be done mechanically, even if the clock, so-called, was electrically driven. An additional consideration for naval predictors was the need to compensate for ship movement at sea, course alterations, and also roll, yaw, and pitch, as well as for target movement. And in the 1930s, only the RN and USN succeeded in providing destroyers with a predictable, capable of controlling effective AA fire while the ship was underway. The essential requirement was for a gyroscope-controlled stable vertical, which was sufficiently compact and responsive for installation in a small ship. As I understand it, others, e.g. Germans and Japanese, could provide effective AA fire from big ships at sea, but not from destroyers when underway. During 1916, the Admiralty had ordered our first destroyer-type vessels designed with long-range, in inverted commas, AA armament. In this case, a 12-pounder gun on a high-angle mount, principally for use against Zeppelins. But post-Jutland and immediately after the war, there was no intention that destroyers' main gunnery armament should be used against aircraft. And that policy was maintained when the post-war prototypes Amazon and Ambuscade were ordered. In terms of armament, they differed little from the late war Admiralty modified W class. Destroyers of the A class, however, the 1927 building program, had a new design of 4.7-inch gun mounting, which was center pivot, so-called, and the design changes offered the potential for high-angle fire, which at the time was believed to be required to counter air attack. But trials by both the RN and the USN in the late 1920s proved that simply mounting high-angle guns on a destroyer would be of little use without effective means of fire control. And furthermore, that the minimum effective shipboard battery of medium caliber AA guns was 4. From such trials, both the RN and USN concluded that destroyers could potentially provide effective anti-aircraft gunfire. There, however, USN and RN thinking diverged. The Admiralty, when considering the E-class destroyers of the 1931 programme, decided, correctly in my view, that destroyers built within the contemporary London Treaty tonnage limitations, that's important to emphasise, couldn't be given an effective medium caliber AA battery with the necessary high angle fire control system without unacceptable sacrifice of other destroyer characteristics. We did, of course, later in the late 1930s convert some older destroyers as in effect anti-aircraft escorts, but without torpedo armament and with not much of an anti-surface armament. Meanwhile, however, the constraints imposed by British governments and international treaties in the early to mid-1930s were such that the Admiralty would order, in the 1932 through 1935 estimates, 4 classes of destroyer, F-class, G, H, and I, in the knowledge that their AA armament was at best inadequate. But at the time, the Admiralty also directed design studies of significantly larger destroyers, a crucial feature of which would be greatly improved AA capability. And as soon as it could, the Admiralty ordered such destroyers. the 16 tribals of the 1935, that was 7 hulls, and 1936 estimates. Edgar March, unsurprisingly, and Trevor Lenton, disappointingly, largely failed to understand the greatly improved AA capability of the tribals, which essentially set the benchmark for all subsequent RN destroyers right through to the Z and CA classes at the end of the war. The guns in the tribals were developed from those fitted to the AA A to I classes, but had a power runner, which is essential if one wanted to engage aircraft with a gun of this caliber. The guns were robust, reliable, accurate, and purely considered a dual-purpose gun, were on a par with the ubiquitous US Navy 5-inch 38. The mounting, twin 4.7 Mark 19, had the guns on a common cradle with power training, the guns power elevated, and had on-mounting fuse setting machines. It only allowed 40 degrees elevation, but that was sufficient to engage torpedo aircraft, and it was also adequate against naval bombers which had any realistic chance of hitting a maneuvering ship. And thirdly, there was the question of fire control. They were fitted with the so-called fuse keeping clock, which was a more compact version of the high-angle control system fitted in cruisers and larger units. And like its USN contemporaries, incorporated a gyroscope stable vertical. Therefore, these ships could engage aircraft while underway at sea. The failure to provide the tribals with a truly high-angle mounting for the 4.7-inch guns has often been criticised, but that would have required a turret, as in the battle-class destroyers, of which it would subsequently be ruefully observed that some 300 tons had thereby been added to their displacement to no good purpose, as wartime experience was that truly high angle, in inverted commas, medium caliber gunfire was largely ineffective against dive bombers and of virtually no value against any other aircraft. That's a diagrammatic of the fuse keeping clock system, which I shall flip through because time is pressing. I shall also mention that FKC and HACS were essentially a flyplane system, but the flyplane was horizontal. Pre-war versions of FKC and HACS did indeed assume that the target was flying straight and level, but that wasn't an unrealistic assumption at the time, except against dive bombers. But to counter dive bombers, the tribals shipped a quadruple 2-pounder mounting. I'll now skate briefly through contemporary USN developments. This is USS Farragut, the first of the new design, so-called 1,500-ton destroyers built for the USN since the Great War. The sophisticated Mark 33 director unfortunately imposed significant top weight, and generally speaking, the stability of this class was always a matter of concern. Furthermore, reliance upon high-angle guns for defence against dive bombers, those 5-inch 38 could elevate up to 85 degrees. So reliance upon high-angle medium caliber guns for defence against dive bombers was found to be largely a mistake. They could put up a pretty effective overhead barrage, or a pretty daunting overhead barrage, but the truth of the matter was the dive bomber had something like a 90% chance of being able to fly through it unscathed. USS Porter, on the other hand, one of the few 1,850-ton destroyers of the USN in the 1930s, had, surprisingly enough, no AA capability whatsoever for its main armament guns, despite the guns being standard 5-inch 38s, albeit in low-angle mountings. This class did, however, have 2 quadruple 1.1-inch mountings, which have an indifferent reputation, but conceptually were probably the best shipboard weapon to counter dive bombers, which was in service in the 1930s, in that they could actually elevate to 110 degrees, i.e. back over their shoulder, and the guns could be traversed either side of 30 degrees, either side of the mounting center line. And that way they could provide a true cone of fire above the ship, even against the vertically diving dive bomber. Unfortunately, these mountings were plagued by problems, which were largely the consequence of its design within London Treaty limitations. My final mention of US Navy destroyers: USS Sims, the first unit first destroyer with the gunfire control system Mark 37, illustrating, in my view, that the Admiralty was correct in deciding that a destroyer designed within London Treaty limitations couldn't have it all. The successor classes after the Farragut's were increasingly top-heavy, until along came gunfire control system Mark 37, which was a triumph for its designers and assemblers, but the first US Navy destroyers so equipped required drastic measures to improve their stability, even before wartime additions such as radar and 40mm and 20mm and 40mm guns were made. Here you see Sims in July 39, November 39, May 1940. And those who look closely will see that in the space of some 10 months, she has lost a complete set of torpedo tubes, and two of the boats have been moved down from Y-mounting level, if you like, down to where the displaced torpedo tubes were. This was all necessary to counter for the increased top weight of fire control system Mark 37. This really is the point at which I shall end. As I said at the beginning, in my view, by 1939, certainly by the end of 1941, when the US entered the war, all of the problems posed by the air threat had been appreciated. And in my view, all of the necessary countermeasures had been put in train, albeit it took some time for them to become fully effective. And that is where I will end.